love that song. Thank you for clapping for Cameron and then for Danielle. Is Cameron still in here? She go, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I just love her boldness. I want us to all be as bold as Cameron is. It's just beautiful. I'd asked them to play that little video before I got up here just because of the words of the song and speaking about, I got a major barrel going on up here, guys. And thanks. Describing the beauty of Christmas. Beauty everywhere. Boy, that describes it well, doesn't it? I want to read part of the Christmas story this morning, and I want to start where it was not so beautiful before it began to become beautiful. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to his own town where they were born to register. So Joseph, who was born in Bethlehem, also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son, and she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. This story has become very beautiful to us. We have a tendency as human beings to take our past and to, no matter how it really was, we have ways of glamorizing it and romanticizing it. We have ways of cladding an old rugged cross in polished gold. And we have ways of wrapping a nativity scene in beautiful porcelain, while, of course, most of you understand that the reality was quite different. Every year I talk about the Christmas story in its reality, which is very different than the cultural presentation. And it's very important that we do that, because if we don't, we'll miss what God was trying to do. And there's a reason why I do this on Ugly Christmas Sweater Sunday. And I keep thinking every year I'm going to win an award. And my daughter tried to help me win an award. My daughter made this for me. Some of y'all, your daughters just buy you ugly ties. Mine makes me an ugly sweater. She got just a plain black sweater. This came off of a table runner she cut off and sewed on. And these little guys were ornaments that she sewed in there. She's quite creative. And it's so ugly, it's cute. But there's a reason why we try to theme this, because we want you to understand the condition of humanity when God stepped into it in human form. This was a day, as we just read, where the political climate was in upheaval. Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census be taken. It was taken for tax purposes. And the people there were being taxed, historians say, most likely 50 to 60% of their earnings. And of course, most of that was not in money. It was in livestock. It was in crops, whatever they had. It was a very oppressive time under Roman rule. And the people, you guys have all, on some level, at some point in life, if not now, have been in a place of poverty probably, maybe starting out. I know that young couples don't start out in poverty exactly like some of us used to back in those days. We started out in poverty. We lived in a house for how many years that didn't even have running water in it. That was kind of normal stories back then. We started very small and worked our way up. And I can tell you this, that when you're battling poverty, it affects every part of your life. And yet the poverty that any of us could relate to shouldn't be fairly called poverty compared to the poverty that is going on in other places in the earth today, and definitely not in Israel when Jesus was born. The oppression was so bad that there were people who would leave their hometown trying to escape it just to go somewhere and try to make a living. And very probably Joseph was one of those people. When this decree was issued, Joseph was not living in Bethlehem, but Joseph was born and raised in Bethlehem, and there is no doubt, at least little doubt, that he was the son of a shepherd. They raised sheep because that's what they did in Bethlehem. For some reason he left, and he left big time because where he currently lived was like 100 miles away, and in those days that was a long way. So we understand the journey back was more than what we can wrap our minds around. It was an oppressive time, and Rome was very cruel. They were a cruel taskmaster to the people. And because of the political condition, it began to ripple into the social condition. And the social condition was reflective of the political condition. The political condition was very oppressive, and it made the social condition very depressive. And the Jews were trying to hold on to this little glimmer of hope that someday there's going to be a Messiah, but generation after generation has passed since those prophecies were uttered. And I would say a lot of people had lost hope that they would be alive to see it. And that's why when Jesus was dedicated in the temple, that the priest was just astonished because he finally got to see with his own eyes what the prophets had spoke of. And many priests prior to him had given up on that. The culture was a dark culture, a depressed culture, a culture that Peter later would describe as an empty way of life. The people didn't own their lives. They were owned by Rome. And they had no defender. Even their own Jewish king, King Herod, was not their defender. He was a political puppet. Here in this police state was a puppet of Rome. And he was even more cruel than Caesar. He was considered in history to be a barbaric murderer. And anytime anyone did anything that he did not like, he had them killed, and there was nothing to stop him. In fact, even though Rome was supposed to be governing what King Herod did, all King Herod had to do if he wanted to murder some people is just say to Rome, they were going to cause a rebellion. And instantly Rome was like, oh, okay, well, good job then. The political climate and the social climate made for very dark, dismal days. And the human condition reflected it. It was a time that, despite what we would try to imagine, it was a very sinful time in the earth. Yes, sin has always been around, but I'm talking about the tangible manifestations of sin in a culture. Sin is mostly hidden by human beings, but there are many times in history that it is not hidden at all. And this is one of those times. The sinful condition tainted their mindsets. It tainted how they began to view each other. And in a culture where there was already a great divide between male and female, it went to brand new levels during the time that Jesus was born. Women basically stayed at home, and men went out and did whatever they wanted. And men could sin, and men could break laws, and nobody did anything about it because they were men. But if a woman did anything considered bad at all, she could be dragged to the city streets and stoned, and nobody's going to stop you. What a day to be married if your wife back-talked you, and you'd had it. You could drag her to the city streets and just tell everyone she's been unfaithful, and they would all pick up stones. There was a huge divide. A lot of the culture, if we don't understand it, then we don't understand the things that the apostles would write later. We wouldn't even understand most of what Jesus was saying if we don't understand the culture. When we took hermeneutics in seminary, it was the class to teach you how to to translate Scripture in context. And one of the primary things that we would learn about would be the culture. Because if you didn't understand the culture, you could not possibly understand what was being said in that culture by the people of that culture. And so later on, when Paul would begin to introduce the kingdom of God to people, and he would introduce it as a kingdom with no male or female, then it would land on them. It doesn't land on us. What does that mean? Big deal. We have equality in this nation. But in a culture where women were just barely a notch above animal status, and men could do whatever they wanted with no repercussions, it meant everything when Paul would say under a grace covenant, now there is no separation. There is no male or female in the kingdom culture. This is a culture that was very religious in that they believed in God, but they were so separated from God, even the true concept and identity of God, who He really was, that they really didn't know Him. They didn't understand Him. They were blown away when Jesus shows up to introduce God to them, because God is nothing like they thought. This is a culture that could not comprehend the concept of intimacy with God, our relationship with God, knowing God. Even though their father Abraham was called a friend of God, that was so far removed from them. They couldn't relate to that. This is a culture that was so distant from God, they weren't even comfortable saying His name. And they wouldn't understand it at the time, but it would become more understood through the life of Jesus and the writings of the apostles how significant that would become. That they were so distant from God, they could not even do one of the most intimate things, call Him by name. They began to refer to Him as would be common in Hebrew culture. The ancient Hebrew culture in the language had no vowels in their alphabet. And so He was YWHW, and it became stretched out as Yahweh eventually, even though that technically is not a biblical term within itself. But when they would write it, to this day, religious Jews, if they write God, they write G-D. They won't say the name of God. They won't say God. He became known in Old Testament culture as Adonai, which meant Lord or Master. It was a descriptive term. It was not a personal term in that this is His name. And so when the angel would appear to Joseph, and he would say, here's what's about to go down. This is going to blow your mind. But this is God. Mary is going to have a child. He's going to be the Messiah, the Savior of creation. And you are to name Him Yahshua. Yahshua was a common name. It's the Old Testament name Joshua. He said, you are to name Him this. You are to call Him this. We look at that now and we don't understand the significance, because in our culture, there's not the proper filters to run this story through. But if we run this story through the filters of the culture that it was birthed in, everything becomes very significant, because suddenly a dark, depressed, oppressed, sin-ridden culture, far removed from God, even though they knew about Him, God sends His Son in the midst of ugliness to begin to build a bridge. And that's what He did. He was birthed in an ugly environment that typified the human condition. It's interesting. We were praying back here this morning, and it just dawned on me that we've seen this story somewhere before. It was at creation. When God stepped into creation before His Word became flesh, where His Word was the mediation between heaven and earth, and He began to speak. And the earth condition, the Bible says, was chaotic. It was empty. Like Peter said, humanity was. There was a void there. It was dysfunctional. It was discombobulated. And God stepped into it, and one of the first things He did was He spoke light. And so it would be significant with the announcing the original symbol that the Christ was ready to be birthed was a shining star in the sky. It was a symbolic gesture from God saying, we're getting ready to burst light into this darkness. And the message would be, follow the light, follow the light, follow the light. Yahshua is birthed in a situation that is not glamorous. It's not covered in porcelain. There's no gold there. Yeah, 2 years later, when the Magi show up with a gift of gold, there's no gold in the nativity scene. Yes, we weren't there, and yes, we have to use our imaginations a little bit, but history does fill in the gaps. We don't have to fill it in with frog DNA. We've got history. We know what was going on in Bethlehem. We know its condition. We know what it was famous for. It was a cavernous region. It was a community of shepherds. And it was a key place because it was there that most of the lambs were being born and raised that would become the sacrificial lambs during Passover. When a perfect lamb was born, and it seemed to be quite perfect to the shepherds, they were set apart and they were bundled quite carefully right after birth. And they were raised in very specific ways, and they were coddled, and they were kept unblemished and pure for Passover. Only fitting that the Passover lamb has to be born in Bethlehem. He's born in a scenario that is just filled with prophetic symbolism, and we sing the songs and we tell the stories, but we've got to stop and understand God is making a speech all through the birth of His Son. Every little element that He has handed to writers through divine inspiration that was not there to see it, but the Holy Spirit shows up with Matthew and with Luke and gives them specific items to remember, to write down, because it's God telling a story. It's God introducing things. And so when they come to this place where the Passover lambs are birthed, and this Passover lamb is to be birthed, there's no room for Him because it spoke of the human element there, the human condition. It spoke of humanity at large, knowing about God, but no personal, intimate place in here for Him to live. He ends up, we assume, in a stable. We assume that because there was a manger there. And that would be historically where a manger would be found, would be in a stable. The stable historically would not be made of rustic wood, but it would be a dark, damp cave. More than likely, behind and even underneath, where there would be a row of houses on top. There's nothing glamorous about His birthing environment. As He's birthed in darkness, dampness, floor riddled with animal feces, and laying in a manger encrusted with dried animal saliva. God intentionally stepping into our ugliness, birthed in ugliness in order to bring beauty. Here's what Isaiah said about His life, which speaks of His birth as it continues to ripple through His life. none of it beautiful. He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God or cursed, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. And that speaks specifically, contextually, of spiritual healing. He's always healed our bodies long before this. He stepped into our brokenness, into our ugliness, into our darkness, into our emptiness, into our suffering, into our sorrow, and it became the makeup of who he was. I was thinking this week, even though for a lot of us who have looked at this and talked about this and researched it for years, it becomes so cliche that we almost want to stop talking about because we think we're broken records. But I was thinking about that this week through the filter of human nature and how we look at history, and I started thinking about JFK. And because I love that period of history, I can sit and watch documentaries 24/7. And especially with JFK, I am so drawn to that whole thing. And the things going on in the White House. The ugliness of sin taking place in the White House, and how many years removed, how we so glamorize and romanticize what was going on. We've done it all through history. Ugly wars and the ugly ways that we've treated each other, and based on color and gender and our ethnic backgrounds. And God was making a point as he steps into the human condition at an ugly peak. And it wasn't just in Israel. It was, as we would see, even as the Gentile nations would begin to be evangelized, the things that Paul was having to address is just incredible. As he steps into churches and writes letters to churches telling them they need to stop having orgies. I look at that and we chuckle and we laugh about that. So that must be pretty bad. He's having to talk to the church about orgies. His letters were to the churches and the things that he had to address, because the human condition was so bad and so far removed from the heart and the nature of God, it was going to take a miracle to reel humanity back in. Isaiah prophesies a little more, though, about his mission. Isaiah 61 says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, which is the grace covenant, and the day of vengeance of our God, but not on those under grace, to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning and sorrow and suffering, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair and depression. And they'll be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor." Isaiah prophesying the whole plan of God, that Jesus, Yahshua, would step into the ugly environment of the human condition, in its darkness, its depression, its oppression, its sin. And he would become part of the environment. He would not come to be intimidating, because people were already intimidated by God. They were so intimidated by the thought of God, they wouldn't speak his name. So God births Yahshua, the Lord's salvation. And He births Him into an environment that reflects the human condition. And He grows up. Despite our romanticizing and glamorizing, He grows up a man who begins to experience in first person the human condition. He experiences the sorrow. He experiences the rejection. He experiences the traveling from here to there, being a hero one day, a zero the next, having to literally be a man on the lam on some days. The Bible would tell stories about he would say something, he would make them mad, they would pick up stones to kill him, and he would disappear through the crowd. His caution when he would just be so moved with compassion and would bring healing into somebody's broken life, and he would say, please, I'm happy to do this, but keep this to yourself. Don't be going and telling people about this. Why? Because he didn't want to get stoned. He's trying to fly under the radar. The angel comes to John or to Joseph and says, Joseph, Mary's going to have a baby. He's the one that your father and your father's father and your father's father has been talking about. The Savior of the world. And you make sure you name him Yahshua. You call him by name, Yahshua. Oh, he'll be called Emmanuel as a title, which is significant, God with us. You are to make sure that you put Emmanuel with Yahshua so you are getting the understanding. He is God now that's with you. He's not far away, and He's your salvation, and you need to learn to draw close to His light. We don't think about it, but His name becomes the first part of the construction project in building a bridge back to God. It was so much more significant than we think that He would be given a name and we would call Him by name. It's the step one to becoming personal with God. Nobody has relationship or intimacy on any level, anywhere, where it does not begin with calling each other by name. And we don't understand or stop to think about the significance, but in that culture, it was huge. Isaiah said He's going to come into your ugliness and He's going to associate with your ugliness, but He has a mission. And as His mission unfolds, here will be the ripple effect. He's going to give you a crown of beauty. He's going to bring beauty out of your ashes. He's going to replace your sadness with gladness. He's going to replace your depression, your sorrow, your emptiness with a garment of praise. He's going to make your life beautiful. Jesus would spend His life now building a bridge from humanity back to God, from God to humanity. He would in fact be the bridge, and we would see all kinds of symbols. The manger would be a symbol, just a simple, non-intimidating thing, a manger, a feeding trough for the beast of the field. The first thing He's laid in is a feeding trough for sheep. Everything God's trying to speak to us. Come to Him, eat of Him, make it personal, take Him inside of you. Let Him make you healthy. His mission has continued for 2,000 years now. And now we look at this time of the year that commemorates His birth, and we all call it the most beautiful time of the year. Because for us it is. and the incredible beauty of the Christmas music, the incredible beauty of the lights, of the ornaments, of the decorations, just the festivities, the glee, the joy that's in the air, the beauty of this time of year so nails in tangible form what God planned from the first Christmas. That all of this would depict what He's trying to do in our lives. From glory to glory, He has been changing us through the generations. And now we are so far removed from the conditions that Jesus was birthed in that we don't even know how to relate to that because we don't have a proper cultural filter to run all that through. But because it's such good news and because we have such deep understanding of why Jesus came that now we reverse everything and we cover it all in porcelain and gold because that's how we see it now. But we need to remember that's not how it started. Now, everything that happened on the grandioso stage of planet Earth is now something that becomes a very private thing in each human being. Doesn't matter where we live, what time we live in, what culture we're in, what we have, what we don't have, if we're a boy, if we're a girl, doesn't matter. We all now find ourselves in a place in life where we're either battling the same human condition, oppression, depression, emptiness, sadness, sorrow. Or we now have manifest the results of Christmas. People with problems, but we're filled with joy. We're not empty. God does not want a single child to feel empty, to feel a void. There's just something missing. There's something missing in my life. Because what happens with emptiness? It leads to depression. Most depression, and I'm not speaking of the clinical, biological types, I'm talking about the most common types of depression, which we call environmental depression. Most of that depression is a result from a void, an emptiness inside of us. And He came to eradicate that. The question for you today is, do you resemble the human condition Jesus was birthed in? Or do you resemble the human condition that His birth has brought about? You see, even in our sorrow, we're supposed to have joy. Even in our grief, we're supposed to find hope and joy. Even in our sadness, there's supposed to be something bigger going on that begins to eradicate and dissolve our sadness. Our emptiness is filled, which is why we say, Jesus, come into my heart. Joey, if you'd come up and play a little bit, and I know it's not on the settings you're going to be used to, but that's okay. You're so good it won't matter, will it? Just saying. I want you guys just stand with me for a second. I just want to pray for some people. You know, when I posted the Hump Day video this week, I usually never even start thinking about what that topic's going to be until I get up on Tuesday morning and I start thinking about it. And then sometime in the day on Tuesday, I shoot it and then we post it on Wednesday morning. I'd thought of several ideas on my way to the fitness center to work out. And something happened while I was at the fitness center which commonly happens where just like that you know exactly what you're supposed to do. And I started thinking about this is a time of year that most people are quite jovial and happy. And, you know, we've had people at our house and we've laughed and joked and cut up, man, just laughing so hard that your side just is in pain at times. It's just such a good time. But I got reminded that this is a very painful time for some people. And that's why I wanted to speak about that in the Hump Day thought, because I realize that this is a time of year where people entertain a lot of sorrow and grief and sadness, mostly because they've lost something. It could be because they've lost a marriage. It could be because they've lost a child, literally, physically, to death. And a lot of times it's because we've lost a spouse to death, or we've lost a parent to death. And I got to thinking about how human that is to grieve, how human it is to be sad, but how God that it is, that even in the midst of those things, to find a life of joy and continuance. That even in sorrow, our purpose is never diminished. That even in loss, we never lose sight of our gains. And I was thinking about that this week because, as I mentioned in the video, last year was our first year without my mom. And sometimes I feel guilty if I sit around with people who are battling the same loss, but a little different response, trying to share with them the joy that we felt as we reminisced together. And the joy that it brought us knowing where she's at right now and the condition she's in right now. The happiness for her, the happiness for my dad. Somehow the Spirit of God removing us from those small nativity scenes and forcing us out into the bigger areas. How significant the next major decree from Herod to kill the baby boys and force Joseph and Mary to bundle up their what was probably around a 2-year-old little boy and head to Egypt. He couldn't save the world if they couldn't save him. But how that depicted the bigger picture of how persecution would come into the church and force the church out of their little boxes and into the world. And I thought about how that is so reflective of what God's trying to do in us, to force us out of these small little scenes that we get bottled up in, boxed in life. We can't move out of it. And the problem is when something happens in life and we become like Lot's wife and we get frozen in that place, and we start looking back at what was instead of what is still to be, then we become a pillar of salt, totally unusable. We can't be sprinkled and bring seasoning to the earth. There's no seasoning in our life anymore. And I thought, Christmas, while it's the most beautiful time of the year, it's also the time of year where we also see that part of humanity that just comes to a dead stop because something happened. And I will tell you that what ripples out of that, if you don't already know, is going to be more depression, more emptiness, the void, the unhappiness, the sadness. And today I just want to pray for you. If you're here today and you'd say, Pastor Scott, I love the Lord and I'm a Christian. Some things have happened, and I'm battling some stuff. I'm battling some ugly stuff in my life right now. I just want to pray for you. And if you're a person that's here today and you say, Pastor Scott, forget that. It's a different story for me. My life is kind of like what you talked about with Israel and the creation story. Man, there's some dysfunctional stuff happening in my life. There's some stuff out of order. I'm battling some stuff, and it ain't good. It's ugly. I want to pray for you. We're not going to ask you for the details. We're not going to even ask you which category you stand in today. I just want to pray for some people that today maybe you'll get a Christmas miracle, and you can get set free from some things that is eliminating you from the most beautiful time of creation. The coming of Yahshua and His grace covenant and His kingdom. A kingdom, Paul said, that is filled with righteousness, peace, and joy. And if you're not knowing that, then I want to pray for you today. If you say today, Pastor Scott, I don't know him. I've never asked him to come into my heart. I want to pray for you. Let's just close our eyes for a second. And I pray, Father, even right now, that you just move upon our hearts, that this would be a moment in time that something significant could happen. Lord, it's not a value statement about us. It's about a value statement of what you want to do in our lives. When we come to terms with where we're at, our own human condition, whether it be sin or whether it be sorrow, whether it be oppression, whether it be depression, emptiness, feeling alone, things that Jesus could relate to with his sorrows and his persecutions, and just feeling like the whole world was against him on days. Today, Holy Spirit, I know you want to take this moment and I want you to minister personally to people. So if I'm speaking to you on any of those levels, any of the above, would you just run up here real quick and let me pray for you? If everybody's life is perfect, that's going to be a wonderful thing. I suspect it's not. Don't keep going that way. Let's trust God to change some things. God brings us this Christmas story as a relatable story to us. Conditions that we can relate to. Real life stuff. My heart was ripped apart this week as I saw that story. Was it on Friday on the Bluefield Daily Telegraph? I saw it laying in the fitness center and I walked over it. It got my attention. I saw the picture of the two teenagers on the front page, and I walked over to the table because I had to see it. I never read a newspaper, and I had to see what that was about, and read the story of these two teenagers that this past year had taken their own life, and the things that as they investigated that they were battling with an emptiness and battling just depression and just in an environmental situation in their lives. It was so ugly. It was so ugly, so ugly. And while that can bring a lot of despair, I want you to know the Christmas story is for real, guys. It changes lives. I thank you today, Lord, that you, first of all, relate to us. The Jews of that day didn't get it. They could not consider the concept on any level that this God, whose name they could not even speak, could on any level relate to them. But you came. You came as one of us. And your word says that you pushed away from the deity side of who you were to take on a full-blown appearance of a man. You went through everything as a man. You relate to us with our temptations, with our sorrows, with our rejections, with our brokenness. You have been there. You relate. And your response from it all was to pour out love and grace like humanity had never seen. Thank you that you can relate to each one up here and what they're going through. Doesn't even matter, Lord, what stimulated it, what caused it. It is what it is. And I know today, Lord, that you are here to minister to the hearts of each one. Lord, help each one know that you know and that they're not alone. And that you're with them. You'll never leave them. You'll never forsake them. And you understand, while they may try to explain to other people what's going on, or maybe they don't try to explain because they don't believe anyone can relate, you know. You understand and you care. And today, Lord, I just declare in your name, your anoma, the nature of who I know that you are. I declare that nature over each one. A nature that releases healing, that brings beauty out of ashes, that comes into brokenness and makes people whole. that restores things to order, that makes all things new. That is your nature, Lord. That's your MO. That's your response to the human condition. And I declare that truth over each one that has found the courage to walk up here today and say, I need God to touch my life today. For anyone that has come up here today that said, I need this Yeshua. I need Jesus. I need the Lord's salvation in my life today. I'm drowning here. I stand with you today in simple faith. As you would say to him, Jesus, come into my heart. I give you my life. I give you my whole life, warts and all. The good, the bad, the ugly, I give it to you today. Pray that even now, Lord, that the very intimate presence of your Spirit will become tangible in their heart. They'll feel your love, your grace, your forgiveness, your acceptance. Thank you for salvation today, Lord. And guys, can I just tell you something? Never battle thinking God can't relate to you. That's why I read those passages. You know that you can preach these passages probably better than I can, Larry. God going out of his way through this whole Christmas story that was launched through Isaiah 700 years before the birth, with him telling us, I am going to relate to you. God, we think God can't relate to sorrow. That's what Christmas is all about. Reminding us, I can relate to sorrow. Brokenness, confusion. Anyone here ever been in an identity crisis trying to figure out who you even are in life? You don't think Jesus went through some of that as he pushes away from the deity, becomes a human being, because the Passover lamb had to be a human. And he's struggling. You see him at that first miracle, turning water into wine, and you can just fill in the blanks with what's going on in him. And his mama's like, you need to do something about this. It's like, I don't know here. And I don't know when he started figuring everything out, but it was kind of like us, step by step. It was a journey. God went out of his way to become one of us, to make sure we understood he can relate to us. Our sorrows, our grief, our stress. He's in the garden. His corpuscles are bursting and there's blood oozing through his sweat glands. That's stress. And yet in the midst of it all, he reveals a life for us that as we go through these relatable things, it does not have to stay this way. Beauty out of ashes, oil of gladness for sorrow, joy unspeakable and full of glory, even in sorrow. Who's grieving in here today? Let me see your hand. Anyone out there grieving? All right, if you are and you didn't raise your hand, you are exempt from what I'm about to pray. And I'm not even kidding, because you need to learn how to find faith. Lord, I declare joy over sorrow today. Lord, where people are grieving, where people are broken because of loss, I declare hope into their life. I speak light into that darkness. And I pray that even today, nay, I declare that joy will overwhelm them, will invade them, will permeate their souls, their minds, their emotions. Scroll back, Lord, that they can see the big picture of life. And today, Lord, they crawl out of that box of grief, that box of sorrow, and into a world of great joy. Great joy. I declare joy over you, baby. I declare joy. Joy. He's going to restore the brokenness. He is restoring the brokenness. That's what He does. And I hear the voice of the Father just saying, baby, just let me in there. Just let me into your grief. Let me into the brokenness. I will make all things new. And I hear the Lord saying, I know you think there's no life after that relationship. But baby, your loss is going to be turned into your gain. And I want you to let me prove that to you. I speak life, life, life. It's all good, baby. It's all good. He's going to prove Himself to you. Your loss is going to be your gain. You just don't see it yet. Y'all okay? Cheer up, buddy. It's all good. It's all good. Well, I don't know what to do. Anybody want this sermon? It won't make it. See if it makes any sense to you. I couldn't follow that thing at all. It makes sense on Friday mornings. I look at it, and I look at it again on Sunday morning. It's like, what the moon was I thinking? It seemed so exciting at the time, and then I get in here, and it's like, it's the most beautiful time of creation. Don't you miss it. Please don't miss next week. Please, please, please. Make it your priority, your agenda. Anyone, everyone you know that is lost, cold, lukewarm, backslidden, get them here. I promise you there's going to be a moment in time that can change their lives. Get them here. Promise them lunch. Promise them whatever you got to do. Get the seekers here next week. All right? Well, thank you for the one amen that I heard. Bless you guys.